of our students and people using the space. So we were able to use that extra $300 to build an expanded room when that opportunity came along. We were so lucky to be able to request additional funding for the expanded space, and we requested an extra $1,000 for that. So some of the wellness concerns at our institution in particular, one of them is co-opting of the term self-care. So students are trying to operate the best they can within the institution, and they're often navigating stressful situations, especially if they're BIPOC, neurodiverse, or do not have the resources, either monetary or informational, to take care of their own wellness needs. We see a lot of institutions, including our own, that try to focus wellness on self-care, which often comes in the form of emails about meditation or drinking more water. These emails can be really misleading and place the burden on the individual rather than enacting institutional change. The other concern that we felt was important was the cost of wellness. The University of New Mexico is a Hispanic serving institution as well as a minority serving institution. We at the Health Sciences Center do not fall under those categories, but the larger institution in which we're under does. A 2020 UNM survey found that 32% of students overall experience food insecurity and 42% experience housing insecurity. And among the most effective were Indigenous, LGBTQIA+, and Hispanic students. Students who are placed in these difficult situations are absolutely going to need help with wellness, and they should not be responsible for the cost of that.
Right. And so the other thing that was really important when we were starting to consider the creation of this wellness room is that since student success is really about both the academic and the social in relation to many other intersecting needs, wants, goals, and values of our students, education in this context is not just about academics, but about the entire experience of our students and their success throughout their careers with UNM and within their communities. A lot of our students do aim to work in New Mexico upon graduation. And so this quote from Symphony Bruce, this quote from Symphony Bruce is really important in that context. I'll just read it very quickly. As university and college students all over the nation to commit to being tens of thousands of dollars in debt, it becomes a social justice issue that not only do they finish, but that they receive the best education possible. And so that was really the spirit of this project at UNM, especially because our health sciences students, as many know, are going into even more debt than most other professions. So in beginning this work, we utilized a feminist pedagogy to approach how we wanted to build the space and what considerations we needed to think about while building the space. And here a quote from McCarty says, "Feminist pedagogy insists on seeing and honoring the full humanity of learners." And so in order to do that, as Howard points out in the same book, The Feminist Reference Desk, we need communication, collaboration, fluidity, need for care, equity, and justice. And so how we worked within these feminist themes. For communication, this was first brought to the JEI, Justice, Equity, and Inclusion Committee, where options and thoughts behind the reasoning were discussed in detail with all committee members. And the committee is made up of stakeholders from across our campuses and students, faculty, staff, and student workers in the library. And so before we moved on to the seed funding process, where we further discussed needs with management, we first brought it to that committee to better understand what they thought would be needed. Additionally, we brought in our Accessibility Resource Center, one of which the members of that group is on our Justice, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. And so we communicated with them throughout the process to better understand what the space would need. Furthermore, we utilized our peer information partners, which are student employees who conduct consultations with other students. We utilize them to discuss how they would best like these types of services marketed to them. And so they had made the decisions on some of the communication that they thought students would deem more important. We also collaborated. This goes along with communication, as you could hear, that was a huge part of this. But we also made sure that different stakeholders were involved. And I think that's really important. This did not stay in the library only. Stakeholders from across the campus were brought in to give feedback, and their feedback was incorporated into the spaces and with updates. We also built in fluidity. We wanted to make sure the room didn't feel like a stagnant place that only offered resources for one type of student. And therefore, additionally, comment cards and a journal are always left in the room to continue to provide for additional needs. And when we did expand the room, which we'll talk about briefly, we utilized those comment cards and that journal to make changes to those spaces. And then lastly, the need for care. The entire emphasis of this project was the need for care for our students and for our employees, and how we could help provide that care without putting the onus on our students. And that then, of course, feeds into that equity and justice. And we'll further discuss these concepts through how we utilized universal design and holistic wellness. So it's very important to us that we utilize concepts that emphasize options and autonomy for our students. And therefore, we engaged with accessibility through universal design, trauma-informed care, and the concept of autonomous space. Our students are not a monolith. And so giving them options and giving them that autonomy was very important. As Moreno and Jackson state, instead of trying to fit our community into pre-existing models where whiteness and dominant culture is the foundation, we have worked strategically to create a model that at its core centers our campus community by employing a holistic approach to the definition of student success rooted in social justice frameworks. This approach is predicated on critical forms of librarianship, in which one of the core tenets is challenging the notion that libraries exist as neutral spaces. And so keeping this in mind, we had to think about what our students would need if we were utilizing these three concepts of universal design, trauma-informed care, and autonomous space. And with trauma-informed care, it was important to have a space where students had an access to a variety of resources, and they could adapt to a variety of needs to break down barriers to access and allow us to not just realize and recognize trauma, but also it became a way to allow our users to respond to trauma in the ways that are best for them. And therefore, we worked to resist re-traumatization in our library spaces. So essentially, making these items and these resources available without having to approach someone and ask for assistance or ask for the items was a way that we could help to not re-traumatize. Next slide, please. Thanks, Varina. I love this quote. I read it and I just feel like it's almost poetry. Autonomies are not institutions, but forms of relation. We need autonomy precisely because we are different. So while autonomous design came from anti-capitalist art movements and are primarily based in the UK and Europe and also South America, we can see important correlations to how we are working to build spaces in neoliberal and capitalist institutions like academia that speak to the vision and mission of open education. The autonomous design group says they understand art as a tool for liberation. We understand that spaces built for and by community can also be a tool for liberation, and they are canvases in their own right. Next slide, please. So what this looked like in adapting with universal design is, as this slide shows, universal design is just good for everyone. An environment or any building, product, or service in that environment should be designed to meet the needs of all people who wish to use it. This is not a special requirement for the benefit of only a minority of the population. It is a fundamental condition of good design. If an environment is accessible, usable, convenient, and a pleasure to use, everyone benefits. So as you can see in this slide, it is not just about someone who might have a disability or someone who is temporarily unable to move in the same ways that they are used to. It's also for someone who has a baby stroller or someone who has a lot of luggage or a group of people. Universal design is just good design. The other thing that's important, though, is we should not expect those who might have differing needs than those that we perceive to have to ask for help or additional resources. This is, again, about autonomy and about resisting re-traumatization. So we had to break down barriers to access. In addition to this being a requirement of universal design, it's also important because we have heard through the years at our institution that many of our students do not disclose illness or disability or neurodiversity due to fear of being kicked out or kind of passively run out of their programs. And so expecting our students to disclose that they might need a different height table or different size chairs was counterintuitive to the theories behind this space and what we know about our student population. As this quote shows, there are several studies that show higher levels of mental health issues and suicide among not just medical students, but all health science students and practitioners. The other important thing to consider is these studies were done pre-COVID. And so we can assume the levels have only risen with the extreme trauma that our healthcare workers have been subjected to through the past few years. What is more, the work of the Justice, Equity, and Inclusion Committee and Student Success and Engagement Librarian and for this wellness room are all rooted in social justice and better understanding the needs of our underrepresented students. As Varina already discussed, while UNM is a Hispanic serving institution and has a high percentage of Indigenous students, the Health Sciences Center itself has low student enrollment of Black, Indigenous, and Hispanic Latino students. As we know, research examining PTSD prevalence in racial and ethnic minority samples has suggested that African Americans and Latino adults may develop PTSD at higher rates than white adults. Therefore, since the environment on the HSC campus might have increased concerns of belonging for these students, and therefore possible increase in exposure to trauma and developing PTSD, we saw the wellness room as a space to help our underserved users have alone time or time with affinity groups on their own terms.
We also really wanted to make this space welcoming for neurodiverse folks. When we were in the research stages of this project, this quote by K.M. Polacek, et cetera, all nicely summed up a lot of what we had in mind. So sensory overload can occur quite frequently for people with ASDs, and that's autism spectrum disorders. Contemporary library environments can bombard us with constant stimuli such as flickering lights, background noise, and countless other sensory distractions. Most people have filtering capabilities and may not be sensitive to external stimuli. However, many with ASDs cannot turn these off, preventing them from concentrating on tasks and resulting in anxiety and exhaustion. The authors also make the point that creating a learning environment that recognizes the emotional well-being of students is of equal importance to the physical environment. So we really thought that was important moving forward with this project and in the development of the space. So considering the factors we've mentioned about our student population, so high levels of stress, trauma, and sensory overload, how could we best put our theory to work to benefit our students and alleviate some of these stresses? We knew it was important to accommodate a variety of needs in this space. It couldn't just be for stretching or just for meditation. It had to have plenty of other wellness opportunities. We also wanted this to be student-centric, with the direction of the room being determined by students, so student-centric and student-led. Privacy was important. We didn't want folks to feel like they were being watched when they were trying to unwind and de-stress. We also thought providing students with comfort items was crucial, since many students might not have access to these types of supplies throughout their day. We wanted to build a sense of community so that these students felt like the wellness room belonged to them and they felt comfortable utilizing the supplies and making recommendations for supply purchases or changes to the space. We also edited our wellness LibGuide to include information on the wellness room and link to other community resources. We ended up placing this as a QR code in the room for easy access. And of course, we wanted to bridge some of the wellness gaps for our student population so that self-care didn't feel unobtainable, and that they had the resources to create some sense of wellness during their busy schedules. I think this is also a good time to give a small shout out to an article we used by Peter Bremer called "Reflecting on Student Mental Health, Creating a Meditation Room in a Small College Library." This article was so helpful when we were developing this project, and outlined the very practical way in which the Rodney A. Briggs Library at the University of Minnesota Morris created their wellness space. I've included the citation on this slide, but it's also in our bibliography. So just wanted to give a brief timeline of the project. Once our proposal was approved and we had funding, we conducted a survey of existing library study spaces to see which room would work best. We needed something that could be converted back to a study room if need be, because this project was a proof of concept project. We determined that a space on the 3rd floor of the library would be best, since that's our most popular floor. And we ended up choosing an individual study room for the pilot room that had movable furniture, and we didn't need to do any construction to get it ready. We then removed the room from our study room reservation calendar. Next, we started identifying and purchasing supplies. As mentioned, we had already read several articles about what other libraries were doing. So we came up with a list of items based on that research and also what we thought our students would be most likely to use and need. I'll talk about what we purchased in just a bit. It was also important for us to get feedback from the students. As Kelleen mentioned, she devised a simple survey to leave in the room. She was also planning to conduct focus groups, which she'll also talk about in just a moment. And as we've mentioned, due to the success of the initial pilot room, we were able to expand the space to a larger room later in the grant cycle. This gave us an opportunity to examine what we had already done, and make adjustments and improvements to the pilot space, which was really exciting. It was a really great part of this project. So, as mentioned, we wanted the wellness room to be adaptable to a variety of needs. In the pilot space, we had some constraints because it was a smaller room. So we needed to purchase low profile furniture. We purchased a couch that could fold out into a cushion for laying down. We also wanted to provide fidget tools and art supplies for unwinding, and also some items for stretching like a yoga mat and a meditation cushion. There is a fairly large Muslim population in Albuquerque, so we definitely wanted to provide a prayer rug for that population of students. Lighting was another concern. It was pretty harsh in the pilot room, so we purchased 2 mood lamps that also had options for calming sounds. When we expanded the space, we added a stable chair, as the couch is a bit low to the ground and may not work for folks with mobility issues. We also added a foam roller for stretching, which was a student request, and also some fake plants to kind of bring nature into the space and add a bit of life. We also added a floor lamp to accommodate the bigger space so that students didn't have to use the overhead lighting, which again was a bit harsh. We added 3 tables, 2 of which are height adjustable and on wheels, so they're able to be moved around the space. And I'm sure, like many other libraries out there, our library is often quite chilly. So we purchased a weighted blanket and also a throw blanket, and added a few pillows to kind of up the coziness of the room. We also installed acoustic tiles to the wellness room and the neighboring study room, so we could kind of cut down on noise transfer between the spaces. So here's a before and after of our pilot wellness room. You can see we did our best to make the space feel cozy. If you look at the bottom right of the second photo there, you can see a couple of prayer shawls that students felt comfortable leaving in the room. This was really great. We had hoped that the students would take ownership over the space and have that level of comfort, so that was amazing to see. The other baskets on the shelf are filled with fidget toys and art supplies. We were also able to purchase an axolotl weighted plush for some added comfort, and it's still pretty popular today in our expanded space. One issue I will mention with the room, and Kelleen briefly touched on this, which we really wanted to change in the expanded space, was the height of this shelf. We couldn't do much as far as removing it at the time, but we did have a sign for folks who might need assistance reaching that shelf to call down to our service desk. That was not ideal, but we tried our best to provide a solution for that. Okay, and here's a before and after of our expanded wellness room. Notice in the first photo that all of the office furniture kind of overwhelmed that space, and it was not a well-used study room to begin with. We had considered this room during our initial space survey, but determined the amount of time the construction would take to remove all that office furniture would set us too far behind within the grant cycle. We fortunately did not have to deduct construction from our grant budget because the library had plans in the works already to revitalize this space long before our project began. So in the expanded space, you can see the couch over here in the bottom right. There's enough room in that room now for that space, that couch to fold out for people to lay down. Here's our sturdy chair, and then of course all of our art supplies and fidget tools. Blankets in this basket here, and a couple of extra pillows. You can kind of see the acoustic tiles on the wall there as well. Those have been pretty successful in cutting back the noise pollution for that room. So we did want to discuss a few challenges with the 2 spaces. Accessibility was a big one. During the pilot project room. That was a very small room. The door was pretty narrow. And again, the shelf was too high for folks using wheelchairs to access. So that really wasn't an accessible space. And that's why we thought it was important to move to a larger space. We've had to balance different needs in the room. So an example that we just had recently brought up was a person needing to use the room to pray, but it was in use by another group. So how do we balance different needs? How do we make sure that the room isn't being taken over by a group and not allowing other people to access that space? So that's something we've had to consider as well. We had to make it clear that the space wasn't a study room. It's around other study rooms on our third floor, the library. So we had to make sure the designation that this was a space specifically for wellness and not for study. We haven't had too many issues around that, but we're always thinking of how we can better clarify the use for our wellness room versus a study room. Kelleen, do you want to step in and talk about the last couple there?
Yeah, thanks, Varina. So management of the space post-project timeline, this is something that we definitely have been thinking about, but in all honesty, utilizing these theories and making it very clear that this has been the student's space, we haven't really had problems with this. The room stays tidy. We haven't had any items go missing. And as Varina mentioned, we've had students leaving materials for other students to use. So that's been really wonderful. We also, of course, had to market the room. So we did do a blast of communication through student newsletters, Twitter, other collaborators, their social media channels. And we also had a launch event where we had a speaker come and talk about wellness from the issues with capitalism lens. And also we had some institutional purchasing options that didn't really fit with our values and ethical stance, mainly that we had to buy most of the materials from Amazon. And so that for us, we were hoping to avoid, but we did, due to purchasing requirements at the institution, have to do that. However, we were able to buy art from Society 6 and you know, I just had to take the hit of like the tax. I had to pay the tax, which is fine. And that way we were able to purchase art from Latinx and Indigenous artists directly. So some of the feedback that we've gotten, I mean, honestly, I'm so excited. It's been predominantly, I mean, actually, it's been all positive. I think one person wanted a different smell in the room, but they weren't even necessarily complaining about the smell. They just thought it could smell nicer. But we did have people reach out to us to tell us how many people were excited for the room. We had someone say that they had stress and laying down for 20 minutes helped them calm down before heading to an exam. And this other one said, "Thank you. I found out my grandfather is dying today, and I was able to know this room was here for me to come and have some quiet alone time and meditate, pray, cry. Thank you." And I think this one, the reason it's important for us to share is this is really what we wanted this space to be, a place for people to deal with their own needs and not be re-traumatized by having to come to us and explain their situation in order to gain access to these resources. And so I think that that was a really important one because, as we know, our students are not just doing a school assignment and have nothing else going on in their lives. So I think that's really important. Additionally, the focus groups that Varina mentioned that I had been conducting, and I need to give a shout out to Jesus Espinoza from University of Michigan because we actually planned those focus groups together. And they really did confirm the need for this space. A large thing that came out of those focus groups were students saying they were always inside and online, especially now in the times of COVID. And it it has been leading to fatigue. So they needed resources to unplug. And so things like the lights that have 500 different RGB settings and things like that were really useful to them. Having options for movement indoors was necessary to feel the wellness of students. That was, again, something, as Varina mentioned, we had a request for a foam roller, right? So we made sure that we're actually responding to those requests and that they have that space. And that was, again, part of why we wanted to move to a larger space so that stretching, yoga, whatever people needed could be done. And then a need for quiet space to unwind was mentioned many times. And even though our library actually is pretty quiet by student kind of led demand, it's still a place for people to disconnect as opposed to being focused on studying, which the other spaces in the library are predominantly geared towards. So our slide deck does have our bibliography. You can also feel free to take a picture of the QR code right now, but we will be making sure, obviously this is being recorded for CLAPS, but we'll also be loading everything into our digital repository so it's openly accessible. And we want to say thank you so much. We have 10 minutes left over for questions. And so we're going to go ahead and stop sharing the screen. And we're going to go ahead and stop sharing the screen. And you can either put questions in chat or by unmuting. And again, in light of progressive stacking, if you are of any minoritized group, whether that be a disability, whether that be a chronic illness, whether that be LGBTQIA+, feel free to put an asterisk before your name and we'll get to those questions first. If you do not want to identify yourself publicly as being part of a minoritized group, please feel free to send those questions directly to Gia.